March 1944. The Atlantic chill clings to the steel hull of a transport ship, rolling gently as it nears the American coastline. German POWs huddled on deck, clutch blankets and rucksacks, eyes wide with curiosity and unease. The salty wind carries the faint hum of distant factories, a rhythm foreign to soldiers accustomed to rationed cities and bombed landscapes. As the gangplank lowers, the prisoner's gaze falls upon sprawling rail yards, steam engines hissing, and freight cars brimming with supplies. Beyond them, smokestacks pierce the sky, belching steady columns of smoke, their silhouettes cutting against the rising sun. Trucks and tractors move in disciplined lines, each machine part of a precise, unrelenting flow. Whispers ripple through the prisoners. Eyes dart from one structure to the next, taking in factories larger than entire towns, assembly lines churning with relentless energy, and workers operating machinery with mechanical precision. For these men, hardened by war and conditioned by Nazi propaganda, the scale is unimaginable. They had expected America to be a distant, naive land. Instead, they are confronted by a nation mobilized for war, vast, efficient, and unstoppable. A stunned silence falls among them, a collective realization forming. They have entered a world far beyond what they had imagined. By 1943, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. On the Eastern Front, German forces faced relentless Soviet offensives. In North Africa, Allied troops were pushing Axis armies from desert strongholds. Across the Atlantic, the United States had fully mobilized, transforming cities, factories, and farms into engines of war. For the men captured and sent as prisoners of war, the contrast between Germany's faltering wartime economy and America's industrial might would soon become evident. German POWs were transported thousands of miles from battlefields in Europe to camps in the United States. Ships crowded with men steamed through Atlantic waters, guarded by Navy vessels, braving both natural hazards and the threat of U-boats. The prisoners were often exhausted, seasick, and anxious, carrying memories of combat and rumors of unfamiliar lands. Yet even before arriving, they had been instructed on American treatment policies, informed vaguely of adherence to the Geneva Convention, and warned that life in captivity, while not brutal, would demand discipline. Upon arrival, POWs were met by an organized reception system. Train platforms and port facilities thrummed with activity. Guards directed the prisoners into waiting transports while clerks recorded names, units, and personal belongings. The scale of coordination was itself overwhelming. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, processed daily with meticulous efficiency. The prisoners could not help but notice the contrast to the bombed-out cities of Germany. Here, trains ran on time. The stations were clean, orderly, and teeming with a kind of purposeful energy foreign to men used to destruction and scarcity. The camps themselves varied in size and function. Some were temporary transit points, designed only to house prisoners for brief periods. Others, larger and more permanent, were constructed with barbed wire, guard towers, and barracks capable of holding thousands. While security was strict, it was measured, disciplined, and, by the prisoners' standards, almost courteous. Guards did not taunt. They enforced rules without cruelty, maintaining order without unnecessary confrontation. The men quickly realized that the United States, despite its war footing, operated on principles different from what they had experienced in occupied territories or under Nazi military command. Within the camps, prisoners were introduced to a structured daily life. Wake-up calls, roll calls, meal schedules, and work assignments provided a rhythm that, while regimented, was predictable. Food, though simple, was abundant compared to wartime Germany. Bread, potatoes, meat, and vegetables replenished POWs who had grown accustomed to rationing. Medical care was available, and sanitation maintained a high standards. Many prisoners would later reflect that this environment, while confining, was humane and at times almost surreal compared to the brutality and deprivation they had witnessed in European theaters of war. Work assignments offered the first real exposure to American industrial might. POWs were often assigned to farms, factories, and logistical centers, contributing labor to support the ongoing war effort. On farms, they witnessed mechanized agriculture, tractors plowing vast fields, harvesters gathering crops with mechanical precision, and storage facilities stocked far beyond what they had imagined possible. In factories, assembly lines hummed with relentless efficiency. Conveyor belts moved materials in a continuous flow. Workers operated machinery with practiced skill, producing tanks, trucks, aircraft, and munitions at a scale the POWs could scarcely comprehend. The contrast between their homeland and this new environment could not have been starker. German cities struggled under Allied bombing campaigns, with shortages of food, fuel, and materials. Factories were damaged or overwhelmed. In America, however, industry thrived. Energy flowed uninterrupted, materials were plentiful, and labor was abundant. Even the speed and coordination of production stunned the prisoners. Men trained to fight in Europe now found themselves swept into a different battlefield, one defined not by bullets and bombs, but by machines, assembly lines, and organizational power. For many POWs, these first impressions planted a seed of awe and disbelief. They had entered a nation fully mobilized, where human effort and mechanical precision combined to create an industrial juggernaut. The realization began to form that Germany, despite its military prowess, faced an opponent capable of producing overwhelming quantities of equipment, vehicles, and supplies. This was not merely a different style of warfare. It was a demonstration of power at a scale they had never encountered. The stage was set for deeper confrontation with the reality of American industrial might. As POWs settled into camp routines and began to explore their surroundings, the magnitude of what they had encountered would only grow. Their astonishment at factories, railways, and mechanized farms would soon crystallize into a profound understanding of the economic and technological forces shaping the outcome of the war. Once inside the camps, German POWs began to experience the United States in a way that few could have anticipated. Daily routines imposed by the camp provided structure. Yet they also offered glimpses into a society fueled by an industrial engine far larger than anything in Europe. Guards escorted prisoners to work details, exposing them to fields of corn and wheat tilled by mechanized tractors, factories producing trucks and aircraft, and rail yards humming with logistical precision. The prisoners observed, sometimes in disbelief, the relentless pace at which machines and men operated in unison. Factories presented a particular shock. Assembly lines stretched for hundreds of meters, each worker performing specialized tasks with exacting efficiency. Giant presses stamped steel, furnaces roared, and conveyor belts moved tanks, trucks, and aircraft from raw materials to finished products in a matter of days. POWs, accustomed to the strained, damaged industrial landscape of Germany, could hardly reconcile the scale of production. The sound of hundreds of machines in harmony, punctuated by the hiss of steam and the clang of metal, became an almost overwhelming sensory experience. Beyond factories, POWs encountered logistical organization unparalleled in Europe. Rail systems moved raw materials and finished goods with astonishing punctuality. Trucks and tractors crisscrossed production sites and distribution hubs, delivering components at precise intervals to maintain the rhythm of manufacturing. Even the simplest tasks, loading crates, assembling parts, or inspecting machinery, revealed layers of coordination designed to maximize efficiency and output. Many prisoners later described the experience as witnessing a living organism, each part functioning seamlessly within a larger, unstoppable whole. Life outside the factory walls also emphasized contrast. The POWs saw small towns and cities thriving, rail depots humming, and farmland cultivated on a scale impossible in war-strained Germany. Food was abundant and varied. Markets displayed produce, meats, and goods that Germans had learned to see only in rationed portions or hear about in propaganda. This abundance struck many with disbelief, highlighting the stark economic disparity between the United States and their homeland. For some, the realization was immediate. America's capacity to sustain both civilian life and war production far exceeded Germany's capabilities. Interactions with Americans further reinforced this sense of contrast. Factory workers, farmers, and civilians treated POWs according to the Geneva Convention. Guards enforced discipline without cruelty, and many civilians engaged politely with prisoners during work assignments. POWs noted the difference between this treatment and the harsh conditions inflicted on forced laborers under Nazi control. For men steeped in propaganda and conditioned to view the enemy as brutal, the combination of efficiency, organization, and humane treatment created a dissonance that was both confusing and humbling. As days turned into weeks, POWs began to recognize patterns. They witnessed assembly lines producing hundreds of aircraft and vehicles, farms feeding entire regions, and logistical systems that could transport resources across thousands of kilometers. Slowly, the scope of American industrial power became undeniable. Germany's own factories, crippled by bombing campaigns and shortages, could not compete. Even highly trained officers and industrial specialists among the POWs struggled to reconcile the scale, speed, and organization of U.S. production with the overstretched, war-torn environment they had left behind. The cognitive shock these men experienced was not only practical, but psychological. Observing the United States' ability to mobilize resources, train workers, and maintain productivity instilled a sense of awe and unease. For many, it became increasingly clear that America's industrial might was not a distant concept. It was a tangible, active force capable of sustaining the Allied war effort indefinitely. POWs began to understand that victory in Europe would not be determined solely by battlefield tactics or individual bravery, but by the relentless capacity to produce, supply, and sustain armies at an unprecedented scale. This immersion into American industrial life laid the groundwork for a deeper understanding of the war's true scale. POWs were no longer mere spectators. They were witnesses to the engine that would, in time, overwhelm Axis production. The realization was slow, gradual, but undeniable. They had arrived in a country whose economic and technological strength could determine the outcome of the global conflict. For German POWs, the first encounter with America's industrial landscape was as much emotional as it was practical. Men hardened by combat, accustomed to scarcity and destruction, found themselves standing before sprawling factories and mechanized farms, struggling to process the scale of production. Eyes widened as assembly lines churned out tanks, trucks, and aircraft at a pace unimaginable in wartime Germany. The hum of machinery, punctuated by the hiss of steam and metallic clangs, became a constant reminder of the nation's ceaseless energy. Whispers of disbelief passed from prisoner to prisoner. They had expected a distant, perhaps naive country, untested by war. Instead, they witnessed an organized, efficient society capable of sustaining both civilian life and an enormous war effort. Some men felt a creeping unease, realizing that the Allied industrial advantage was not theoretical. It was immediate, visible, and intimidating. Others could not suppress admiration for the sheer coordination, endurance, and ingenuity displayed by workers and machines alike. Leadership angle, order and discipline in camps. American officers and camp administrators played a crucial role in shaping POW perceptions. Rules were enforced with precision, maintaining order without cruelty. Roll calls, work assignments, and schedules provided structure that, while strict, was predictable and humane. Guards balanced security with civility, observing Geneva Convention guidelines while ensuring compliance. For the POWs, this approach was startling. Unlike the harsh and often arbitrary authority structures they had known, camp leadership demonstrated that discipline could coexist with fairness. Officers' efficiency mirrored the larger industrial systems outside the barracks, predictable, organized, and effective. The prisoners began to recognize that the same principles that governed factories, coordination, accountability, and routine were reflected in the treatment of men. Authority was exercised not through fear, but through structured systems that maintained order while respecting human dignity. Technological angle: machinery as a weapon of war. The POWs exposure to American factories revealed the staggering scale and sophistication of industrial technology. Massive presses, conveyors, and assembly lines moved in precise harmony. Aircraft fuselages were welded, tanks assembled, and vehicles outfitted with armaments in a continuous flow. Steam engines hissed, metal clanged, and electric motors whirred, producing an overwhelming symphony of productivity. German soldiers, many trained in technical disciplines, could not ignore the implications. The machinery was more than tools. It was a force multiplier, capable of sustaining and supplying armies at a rate Germany could not match. Each factory, each assembly line, became a living demonstration of American ingenuity and industrial might. The POWs recognized that warfare was no longer decided solely by skill on the battlefield. It was determined equally by the capacity to produce, maintain, and mobilize. Transition to enemy perspective. The combined weight of human awe, disciplined leadership, and technological marvels prepared the POWs for a deeper realization. Beyond their personal impressions, the industrial environment forced them to confront a strategic reality. Germany was falling behind. The scale of American production, the efficiency of its workers, and the organization of its society were evidence that the Allies' advantage extended far beyond the front lines. This awakening would shape reflections on military capability, economic power, and the true determinants of victory in modern war. For the POWs, the shock of America's industrial might was only beginning to sink in, setting the stage for the next layer of understanding. Enemy perspective, confronting the reality of Allied strength. As German POWs toured factories, rail yards, and farms, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The enemy they had been trained to fear and often dismiss was far stronger than they had imagined. Reports from Europe had painted America as a distant, industrially inexperienced nation. In reality, it was a powerhouse of production and organization. POWs observed steel rolling into tank hulls, aircraft fuselages being welded with precision, and trucks lined up for shipment to battlefronts, all produced in staggering numbers. The realization struck hard. Military training and battlefield experience alone could not counterbalance such industrial capacity. POWs began to understand that Germany's tactical skill and battlefield courage were insufficient against a foe capable of replacing losses almost instantly. For many, the psychological impact was profound. The war was no longer solely fought in foxholes and air battles. It was also fought in factories and assembly lines far from the front. Moral/ethical angle, treatment, and the human factor. The humane treatment of POWs contrasted sharply with the brutality they had witnessed under Nazi occupation. Food was plentiful, medical care available, and regulations enforced fairly. This adherence to the Geneva Convention challenged long-held assumptions about the enemy. German soldiers were struck by the irony. While their own military regime imposed fear and brutality, the Americans achieved order through fairness, respect, and efficiency. These observations reinforced the broader impression of American society, a nation capable of extraordinary industrial output without sacrificing basic humanity. POWs noted the contrast between efficient production and ethical conduct, a balance that seemed almost alien in a war defined by violence and destruction. Tactical/strategic angle. Industrial might as a weapon. Beyond human reactions and moral reflections, POWs gained insight into the strategic implications of American production. The sheer scale of output, aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, demonstrated that Allied forces could sustain campaigns indefinitely. Factories operated around the clock, workers rotated shifts, and supply chains delivered raw materials and finished goods with precision. German soldiers recognized that no battlefield tactics, could offset this advantage. Even if German units won engagements, the Americans' capacity to replace losses, reinforce troops, and maintain supply lines made long-term victory increasingly unlikely. Industrial power, POWs realized, was now a decisive instrument of war. Cultural angle, exposure to American society. While laboring on farms or in factories, POWs observed everyday American life. Orderly towns, functioning public services, and an abundance of food and goods. Schools, shops, and railways operated smoothly, revealing a society mobilized yet thriving. For soldiers accustomed to cities under siege and rationing, the sight was jarring. Cultural exposure deepened their understanding of the contrast between Germany's war-strained economy and America's seemingly inexhaustible resources. POWs reflected on the organizational skill and societal cooperation required to achieve such efficiency. This cultural dimension complemented their technical and tactical realizations, providing a holistic sense of the Allied advantage. Transition to climax. By the end of their initial months in the United States, German POWs had assimilated multiple perspectives: human, technological, moral, and strategic. Each angle reinforced a singular conclusion. The American war machine was vast, organized, and relentless. The next stage would bring them face to face with the full spectacle of industrial power. Factory tours, shipyards, and mechanized farms would crystallize their understanding, delivering moments of shock, awe, and reluctant admiration. The stage was set for the climax when the scale, speed, and efficiency of American production could no longer be abstracted. It had to be experienced firsthand. By the spring of 1944, German POWs assigned to work details found themselves standing at the threshold of industrial titans. In Detroit, the heart of America's automotive and tank production, men accustomed to rationed cities and bombed factories could hardly comprehend the scale before them. The roar of machinery filled cavernous halls, punctuated by the rhythmic pounding of presses and the hiss of welding torches. Assembly lines stretched for hundreds of meters, moving steel and components in a precise, unrelenting flow. POWs were escorted through these factories under the watchful eye of American officers. Tanks were assembled in stages, each section handled with choreographed efficiency. Workers, their movements fluid and practiced, operated massive machinery without hesitation. Conveyor belts carried partially constructed vehicles past stations of specialized laborers, each man performing a single, essential task. The sheer speed and coordination created an almost hypnotic rhythm. For many POWs, disbelief was immediate. Whispers passed from one man to another. Eyes widened as they took in not just the quantity, but the quality and consistency of production. In Europe, German factories struggled to replace losses, many damaged by Allied bombing or hampered by material shortages. Here, entire fleets of tanks and armored vehicles were being completed in days, with precision and reliability that challenged every preconception. Rail yards adjoining the factories added another layer of astonishment. Freight cars were loaded and dispatched with clockwork accuracy. Engines thundered, transporting finished products to ports, airfields, and training centers across the country. POWs observed the scale of logistics, understanding that machinery alone was insufficient. Organization, coordination, and manpower were equally crucial. America's war effort was a living network, each component feeding seamlessly into the next. The shock deepened when POWs were shown aircraft assembly plants. The production of fighters and bombers revealed capabilities that Germany's Luftwaffe could scarcely match in quantity or consistency. Rows of B-24 Liberators and P-51 Mustangs, engines mounted, wings attached, lined hangars in formation. The roar of test engines, the smell of fresh paint, and the sight of workers moving with synchronized precision made an indelible impression. German soldiers, trained to value efficiency and engineering, recognized that these were not merely machines. They were instruments of strategic dominance. Amid this spectacle, POWs began to articulate the implications aloud. "Germany cannot compete," one whispered, his voice barely audible over the machinery. Another shook his head, stunned, noting the speed with which equipment could be repaired, replaced, or deployed. It was not only the volume of production, but the integration of entire systems, factories, transport, supply chains, that revealed the magnitude of the challenge Germany now faced. Even outside the factories, POWs witnessed the enormity of American industrial power. Mechanized farms stretched across hundreds of acres, tractors plowing, harvesters gathering crops, and storage facilities brimming with food. Coal-powered plants, steel mills, and shipyards demonstrated energy and resource management at a scale unimaginable to men accustomed to shortages. Each tour reinforced the impression that American society functioned like a machine itself, every part synchronized to sustain the war effort. The emotional impact was profound. Shock, disbelief, and all mingled with unease. POWs realized that what they had perceived as enemy propaganda or exaggeration was, in fact, reality. The strategic landscape was no longer abstract. It was tangible, overwhelming, and immediately visible. The industrial might of the United States was not a distant threat. It was a palpable force that could and would shape the course of the war. By the end of these tours, the prisoners carried a new awareness. America's strength lay not only in its armies or weapons, but in its ability to produce, sustain, and project power across continents. For men who had fought fiercely in Europe, the revelation was both humbling and terrifying. They were confronted with the full measure of a foe whose capabilities would determine the ultimate outcome of the conflict. The stage was set for the continuation of this realization. Additional sights, interactions, and observations would deepen the POWs' understanding. The climax was far from over. The next phase of the POWs' immersion into American industrial might took them to shipyards, steel mills, and additional mechanized farms. At the Detroit River shipyards, massive hulls of naval vessels rested on slipways, each one a testament to coordination and manpower. Cranes lifted steel beams into place with precision, while welders and riveters moved in a rhythm that resembled a carefully choreographed dance. The prisoners, accustomed to Europe's damaged ports and bombed shipyards, could hardly believe the scale and speed of construction. Nearby, steel mills produced raw materials at volumes that Germany could only dream of replacing. Molten metal flowed from furnaces into molds for tanks, vehicles, and industrial machinery. POWs watched conveyor belts transport red-hot steel across massive floors, sparks flying like controlled firestorms. Every movement was deliberate, synchronized, and purposeful, a visual embodiment of the United States' capacity to sustain total war. Mechanized farms continued the lesson. Tractors and harvesters moved across vast fields with precision, grain elevators hummed, and barns were filled to capacity. POWs saw agricultural logistics integrated into the war effort. Food production for both civilian populations and military forces, a network that maintained supply lines across the country and abroad. For men who had endured scarcity and rationing, this abundance was astonishing. Interactions with American workers further emphasized the scale and coordination. Skilled laborers and engineers explained processes with patience and precision. POWs began to understand the human dimension behind the machines. Training, experience, and discipline were as critical as steel and engines. Observing this interplay of human skill and mechanical power, prisoners realized that American industrial strength was not an abstract number. It was a living, breathing system capable of adapting, maintaining output, and sustaining operations even under pressure. The psychological impact on the prisoners was profound. Many began to compare their expectations of America, naive, distant, and militarily inexperienced, with the reality they now witnessed. Each factory tour, shipyard visit, and farm inspection reinforced the same conclusion. Germany could not match this scale of production. Even with the finest technology or battlefield tactics, the Axis powers were fundamentally outmatched. By the time the POWs returned to their camps at day's end, a heavy silence often fell. Conversations were subdued, thoughts measured. The spectacle of American industry had instilled awe, respect, and a quiet fear. The war was no longer fought solely on battlefields. It was being waged in factories, shipyards, and fields, and the Allies had the capacity to outproduce and outlast the Axis in ways previously unimaginable. Some prisoners later reflected on the cognitive dissonance they felt. They had been trained to fight an enemy, yet the real confrontation was now revealed in the hum of assembly lines, the roar of furnaces, and the precise movements of workers across sprawling facilities. Military skill alone could not overcome such industrial power. For the POWs, this revelation marked a turning point in their perception of the war and their own role within it. By the end of these tours, the climax of the POW experience had fully crystallized. Shock, admiration, and reluctant understanding converged. America's industrial might was a decisive weapon in itself. The prisoners carried this realization back to the barracks, their conversations subdued, their observations internalized. The war, they understood, would not be won solely on the front lines. It would be determined by the capacity to produce, sustain, and mobilize, a capacity at which America excelled. This awareness set the stage for the aftermath. POWs would begin to adapt to camp life, participate in work details, and reflect on the implications of what they had witnessed. Their experiences would shape not only immediate behavior, but long-term perceptions of the United States and its capacity for warfare. In the weeks following their factory and farm tours, German POWs began to settle into the rhythms of American camp life. Daily routines provided structure: wake-up calls at dawn, roll calls, assigned work details, and evening meals. While the barracks were confined, the treatment was fair, orderly, and humane. Guards enforced rules with precision, ensuring compliance without cruelty, a stark contrast to the harsh discipline the POWs had encountered in Europe. Work assignments became the lens through which prisoners continued to observe America's industrial and logistical might. On farms, they operated mechanized tractors, harvested crops with modern machinery, and assisted in storage and distribution of produce. In factories and rail yards, they handled materials and components that would soon become vehicles, aircraft, or weapons on the front lines. Each task, however minor, was connected to a larger system, revealing the scale and integration of American war production. Letters and reports from POWs during this period reflected a mix of awe, disbelief, and grudging respect. Many wrote home describing the factories, the speed of assembly lines, and the abundance of food and materials. Officers noted changes in prisoner demeanor. Initial defiance or skepticism gave way to curiosity, acceptance, and, in some cases, admiration for the organizational skill on display. The camp administration recognized that exposure to American life and industry was shaping prisoners' perceptions as much as confinement itself. The human impact was significant. POWs witnessed the contrast between their expectations, shaped by wartime propaganda and limited knowledge of American society, and the reality of a nation capable of mobilizing vast resources efficiently and humanely. Conversations among prisoners often centered on astonishment. The scale of production, the efficiency of workers, and the integration of logistical systems were beyond comprehension for men accustomed to bombed-out factories and rationed cities. Even in leisure hours, the influence of American industrial and cultural systems was evident. Some POWs were allowed to engage in educational activities, learning English, understanding local customs, or observing civic structures. Recreational programs, sports, and supervised excursions offered glimpses of everyday American life. For many prisoners, these experiences reinforced the idea that they were not merely captives. They were witnesses to a society operating at a scale and efficiency that could sustain a global conflict. Strategically, the lessons learned during this period were profound. POWs recognized that no matter how skilled German soldiers were on the battlefield, they faced an adversary capable of replacing losses, supplying troops, and maintaining operations with unrelenting efficiency. The factories, farms, and logistical networks were not just tools. They were instruments of warfare that could determine the outcome of campaigns long before soldiers ever reached the front lines. Psychologically, the shift was subtle but significant. Initial shock gave way to understanding, and sometimes to a grudging respect for American organization, productivity, and discipline. For senior or technically trained prisoners, the realization of the Allies' industrial advantage shaped their perspective on the war's trajectory. Discussions in barracks, in letters, and later in memoirs emphasized that victory depended as much on production and supply as on courage and strategy. By the end of this phase, the POWs had assimilated a new awareness. America's war effort was not a collection of isolated efforts, but a coordinated, integrated system. Each worker, machine, and transport vehicle was part of a larger mechanism capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. The climax of their exposure, the awe-inspiring factory tours and mechanized farms, had solidified into comprehension. The stage was now set to explore the broader consequences of these experiences, how they influenced POW behavior, morale, and long-term understanding of the war. As the months passed, German POWs became more accustomed to life in American camps. Yet the impressions of industrial scale and societal organization remained indelible. Work assignments, whether in farms, factories, or logistical centers, offered continual reinforcement of what they had witnessed during the initial tours. Even routine labor was now understood as part of a broader system, feeding into an endless cycle of production and distribution that supported the war effort. Reports from camp officers highlight the profound effect on prisoner morale and behavior. Many POWs shifted from skepticism to cautious engagement, demonstrating a willingness to follow instructions and adapt to camp routines. Some became unofficial guides, assisting fellow prisoners in understanding the machinery, processes, and organizational structure around them. Letters and post-war memoirs later described a mixture of awe, disbelief, and reluctant admiration for the United States' capacity to mobilize, supply, and sustain military operations on a global scale. Strategically, POWs gained a clear understanding of the Allies' industrial advantage. Factories were not just producing vehicles or munitions. They were sustaining a continuous, self-renewing force that could withstand attrition far beyond Germany's capability. Shipyards delivered naval vessels at unprecedented rates. Steel mills churned out raw materials, and mechanized farms ensured a constant flow of food to troops and civilians alike. Every observation confirmed the same principle. The scale, coordination, and efficiency of American production had become a decisive instrument of war. The psychological impact on the prisoners was equally significant. Many recalled the cognitive dissonance of seeing abundance where they expected scarcity, efficiency where they anticipated disorder, and humane treatment where they feared cruelty. This dissonance prompted reflection on their own society, military systems, and industrial limitations. Some POWs later described a sense of humility, recognizing that Germany's battlefield skill could not offset America's overwhelming productive capacity. Cultural exposure further reinforced these realizations. POWs engaged with American workers, observed civilian life, and noted organizational practices that contributed to the nation's wartime efficiency. Education programs, supervised excursions, and recreational activities offered insight into societal norms, reinforcing the impression that the United States had mobilized not just material resources, but human capital and social cohesion. The cumulative effect was a profound recognition that America's strength extended far beyond technology or numbers. It was embedded in the very structure of society and industry. Long-term reflections, recorded in memoirs and interviews, emphasized the lasting impact of these experiences. POWs carried with them memories of assembly lines, shipyards, and mechanized farms, understanding that they had witnessed a force that would play a decisive role in the war's outcome. The initial shock, once visceral and immediate, had evolved into a deeper comprehension of the strategic implications. Germany's military skill alone could not overcome a nation mobilized on such a scale. By the conclusion of their internment, the POWs had absorbed a complex picture of American industrial and societal power. Awe, respect, and reluctant acknowledgement of the Allies' advantage became enduring themes. The experiences of work, observation, and interaction transformed their understanding of modern warfare, demonstrating that victory was determined as much by production and logistics as by courage and battlefield tactics. This period of aftermath naturally leads to reflection. The POWs experience offers insight not only into the realities of World War II, but also into broader truths about industrial power, societal organization, and the human capacity to mobilize resources effectively. Their shock and admiration provide a lens through which to consider the transformative impact of American production on the outcome of the conflict and on the prisoners themselves. The story of German POWs in the United States is more than an account of captivity. It is a testament to the transformative power of industrial might and societal organization. For men hardened by battle, accustomed to rationed cities and scarred landscapes, America's factories, farms, and logistical networks were revelations. They bore witness to a nation that had mobilized every resource, human and material, with precision, efficiency, and purpose. This confrontation left an enduring impression. Shock turned into understanding. Disbelief became respect. The POW saw firsthand that warfare in the modern era extended far beyond bullets and strategy. It encompassed assembly lines, mechanized farms, coordinated transport, and the unwavering rhythm of human labor harnessed to a singular objective. They realized that victory was as much a product of production, organization, and sustained effort as of tactics and courage. Equally striking was the humanity interwoven with efficiency. POWs noted that discipline did not require cruelty, that order could coexist with fairness, and that a society could achieve extraordinary results while maintaining ethical standards. These